welcome to the Locked Up Festival. My name is Louise Fairbairn. I'm a freelance journalist and former crime fiction reviewer for the Scotsman newspaper. I talk a lot about books on Twitter, and I have a blog at crimebookgirl.com should you be that interested, but it's fine if you're not. Feel free to chat away to each other in the chat box if you've got questions for our authors, and I really hope you do, because you've got them here. There's a Q&A box somewhere down the bottom, so stick your questions in there. Right. Let's introduce people who, you don't need me to introduce them, but I'm going to anyway. Liam McIlvanney grew up in the west of Scotland, but now lives about as far away from home as you can get while still seeing a statue of Robert Burns and the Water of Leith, which is to say it's in Dunedin, the South Island of New Zealand, where he is the Stewart Professor of Scottish Studies at the University of Otago. And that's just a wonderful title. He describes himself on Twitter as a, quote, slow motion crime writer. But while he has only published 3 novels, yeah. Yep. 2 of them have won awards, so that's pretty good in my book. Val McDermid is the undisputed queen of crime fiction. She has published 34 novels, which have sold more than 16 million copies worldwide, which is just insane. Also wonderful. She has written non-fiction, children's book, and recently a graphic novel version of Resistance, which I think began life as a radio play. Which is a string of awards, a string of awards, several honorary degrees, and the most envy-inducing bookshelves I've ever seen. And I'm talking about the shelves, not the contents. The library ladders and the whole thing, it's fantastic. And of course, she is the shirt sponsor for her beloved Wraith Rovers. There is only one Val McDermid. So, welcome to everybody else. Let's start with the elephant in the room and also the joy of online. So, I'm in Edinburgh. Val, you're in Edinburgh, and Liam, you're in the other Edinburgh.
I'm in Edinburgh for South, yeah.
How did you get there? What took you there? And
Yeah, I answered an email in an idle moment, Louise. There was one of these academic search companies advertising this job in Dunedin. And at that stage, I don't think I even knew there were sort of 2 main islands in New Zealand. My ignorance of New Zealand was pretty comprehensive. But I kind of answered this email, and one thing led to another, and we finished up 12,000 miles away in the Edinburgh of the South.
What is it about New Zealand now that keeps you there, apart from obviously the job and things like that? But what is it that you love most about it as a country?
I don't know. It's well, I suppose now in this current context for the past year or so, it's been the kind of surreal normality of New Zealand that's been most striking. We're sort of getting on with our lives, and going to pubs and restaurants and having live events with writers and so on. And yeah, then you suddenly realise that the rest of the world's not experiencing that. So yeah, it's been a bit odd and surreal this past year.
Val, you went out as a visiting professor as part of Liam's Scottish Studies department. Can you tell us a bit about how that all came about?
Liam had been asking me for some time if I would come out and do a stint as a visiting professor, and my life was too complicated to accommodate it for quite a while. And in fact, he was counting down the days till my son started at university and said, right, now your son's away, you can come. And so I did my first stint in 2019. I was there for like 2.5 months, and I had a wonderful time. Totally loved it. I found it completely relaxing. The people were friendly. It's a beautiful place. Good beer, good ice cream, marvelous landscapes, and it was really a good place for me. It was I found it a good place to work. My partner Joe and I actually put together a book, Imagine a Country, when we were in Dunedin. So it was really a place where productive and also great writers there, great community of writers, and astonishing older women. It's full of these amazing older women in their 70s and their 80s, chopping down trees, building wood piles, and writing their first crime novel at 89 and things like that. So it's a place where I certainly think we felt at home. And I was just absolutely scunnered that we didn't get last year, and I'm still hoping we can get back this year, but we'll have to see how that goes. Yeah, everything crossed.
Everything crossed. It's a fabulous place. I mean, I was there in 2004. Definitely want to go back at some point eventually. It's a long way. And, you know, much as I love traveling for a book festival, it's a tiny bit of a long way just to go for, you know, Celtic rock. What do you miss about Scotland when you're not in it? Because Val, you lived in various bits of England for a while. Obviously, Liam, you're in New Zealand. So what is it other than family and friends that you miss about Scotland when you're not in it?
Haddock. You can't get haddock in New Zealand. So as soon as I step off the plane, I kind of mainline haddock. So I go to get a fish supper in Largs, or go to Cafe Gandolfi in Glasgow, and just eat as much haddock as I possibly can.
I had smoked haddock for my tea.
Oh, stop.
And I have to say, I'm much the same. I mean, one of the things that I really missed was a good fish supper, because in England they do cod, or they do haddock with the skin on it, which is just barbaric. So yeah, I missed that when I was living abroad in England, and I did miss. I was thinking about this today, because I've been writing a piece for the Financial Times about what it is about Scotland that is really important to you. And I wrote about the Scots language, the Scots tongue. When you get back, I always used to find when I was in Oxford and I was on the train coming back, and I got on the train from Edinburgh to Kirkcaldy, and hearing the Fife tongue just made me think, I'm back, I'm home, it's sorted. So there's strange things that you miss when you're away. It's not always the things you think you're going to miss.
Now, the one thing I missed when I went traveling I was away for about 9 months, the one thing I really missed, and this is very bizarre, was Branston pickle. Because you get Australia and New Zealand, you get all kind of fancy, lovely, fantastic condiments. You don't get a nice jar of Branston pickle. But, you know, maybe it's just me. Would you set a book in New Zealand? Either of you? I mean, I know, Liam, your next one is, it's a follow-up to the Quaker, so I'm kind of assuming it's in Glasgow / the UK.
It is, yeah. Tempted? Yeah. Well, I have. I mean, I've started, I'm in the middle of not in the middle of it, the start of a book set in Dunedin at the moment, but I'm writing about 3 things just now, so I just need to work out what's going to sort of take the lead and get finished first. But yeah, I mean, I suppose I remember suggesting to my then agent, Derek Johns, that I might set a book in Dunedin, and his line was, "What, are you mad, son? Who's going to want to read a book set in New Zealand?" But I don't know whether the success of Eleanor Catton and indeed of Vanda Simon, who's been going great guns in the UK, may have changed that. I'm really looking forward to the Val McDermid novel set in Dunedin, which I think has to happen at some stage, surely.
Oh, surely.
I'm trying to figure out how to get Karen Perry there. I would be kind of wary of setting a book in Dunedin, because, or indeed in New Zealand at all, because although we spent like 2.5 months there and we're planning to come back more for long periods, I still don't know it like a native. So I would have to write it from the point of view of somebody who's there as a visiting fireman. And I'm not sure how I could manage to achieve that convincingly. But it's tucked away in the back of my head. It's always possible. What I imagine might come first is some short stories.
Sometimes it's quite useful, though, to write about a place that you know superficially. Do you know what I mean? I mean, sometimes I feel if you're writing about a place you grew up in or you know intimately, you've kind of get too much information. It could be quite useful, writing about somewhere that you've visited a few times and know kind of superficially. I did in my first novel, the big middle section is set in Belfast, which is a place I know really superficially. I've been sort of 8 or 9 times and seen the kind of tourist areas. And I was taken round by a guy called Henry MacDonald, who's the Guardian's Ireland correspondent for about 4 days before I wrote this section. And it was brilliant. I had, just enough data and material that I felt I could sort of convey this kind of pattern of authenticity without being sort of bogged down in the detail. It may be that people actually from Belfast thought it was rubbish, but I had good fun writing it.
Oh, damn, I've already been in Dunedin too long.
That's it. You've wasted it.
There's something to be said for writing as an outsider, or having a character as an outsider, whether geographically or otherwise. I always find I was rereading The Quaker thinking, because McCormack he's a Highlander, he's Gaelic speaking, and he's in the flying squad. He knows Glasgow as well as the rest of the guys in the team, but to them, he is an outsider, and he is what brings us into the novel, if you like. We're seeing it with him, and we're kind of relearning the city with him. How do you?
Yeah, I think that's also I think it was Henri Gide who said that you don't want to write too autobiographically, write about a character that's too close to you. So I find with Duncan McCormack, I'm doing a bit of that. If you write about someone who's got some of the same experiences as you, but some things are different, and you can then approach it from a bit of an angle. So the fact that he's a Highlander, the fact that he's gay, which I'm not, those are sort of challenges to try and inhabit a character, and they give you a kind of in to a character that might be a little flat if it was just sort of totally based on your own kind of direct autobiographical experience.
Yeah, I think it's important to step away from your own personality, your own personal experiences. But the problem is, when you write a character who has superficial resemblances to some aspects of your life, readers assume that the character is you. And that's not the case. For a long time, people would think because I was a journalist that I must be Lindsay Gordon. But in so many ways, I am not Lindsay Gordon, and I'm not Karen Perry either, even though she's Fae Fife. So it is. Everything is filtered through the sort of crucible of the imagination. You might start off writing about a character because you know the facts of that life. You know what it's like to be a journalist in that situation in the 1980s, whatever. But the things that you put them through and their reactions to them are not your reactions.
Well, yeah, I was thinking about your next book is a journalist, and your first books were journalists while you were still working as a journalist yourself, right? And I'm always intrigued about, because I am a journalist as well, I'm always intrigued about how they are portrayed in novels, and there's so few, I find, other than by people that used to do it for a living, that are remotely accurate. And you have to bend all of the rules in terms of making the story work, but there are so many things that are incredibly annoying. And so it's always nice to see somebody who knows what they're doing writing one. So I'm very interested also to see how you approach, I've forgotten her name, Ali
Burns.
Ali Burns for 1979. In terms of, you were writing Lindsay Gordon as a contemporary, but you're writing Ali Burns as a historical thing. Are you looking at it differently, or can you?
I think, yeah, distance lends disenchantment in some ways. I can see it more clearly than I did then. And the things that you kind of put up with, and you think, why did I put up with that shit? And the number of bloody miracle babies I wrote about in the course of my years at the Daily Record are quite staggering. But it was the thing that I guess what I can bring to it is a sense of authenticity, a sense of knowing about the kind of things that happened. And I'm sure there'll be moments when people are reading this where they're going, I don't believe that. And some of the anecdotage is mine, some of the anecdotage is what happened to other people. But there's a lot of stuff in there that's quite closely based on things that actually happened, that I know about, because that's what gives it that whiff of authenticity. But the people in the book are not the people that I worked with, and that's not me. And certainly the events of the book, the key events at the heart of the book, did not happen as far as I'm aware. But I think you're right about that. People also have a romantic notion of what journalism is like, and they don't really think about the wet winter afternoon when you're sitting in a car on a stakeout, and it's freezing cold and you're miserable, you've nobody to talk to, and at the end of the day, nothing happens. And so I've tried to convey the authenticity of it. I actually consulted with my former colleague Ruth Wishart, as Ruth was the women's editor at the Daily Record when I started there as a very, very green baby reporter. So I got Ruth to. I spent some time with Ruth talking about the old days and getting quite a lot of gossip that I didn't even know about at the time, also got her to read the first draft just to check that I hadn't gone too egregiously off-piste.
Can't imagine you doing that.
Well, your memory plays strange tricks. I went to the National Library of Scotland, and I was reading the Daily Record for the 1979 when I was working there, and I kept coming across stories with my byline on that I had no recollection of ever having written, which was quite bizarre.
Yeah, well, I suppose you probably wrote quite a few things, and not everything sticks in the mind. When I moved house, I uncovered a box of newspapers that I had obviously kept for some reason, the reason presumably being that I'd written like some great headline, and I'm flicking through them going, yeah, so couldn't remember anything. That all went in the bin. This is the thing, the joys of production, nobody knows you exist. I was going to ask how the day job, the ex-day job, the day job that perhaps you always wanted, how it all has fed into how you write and what you write about. I'm not sure that, Liam, you're writing a lot about academics and that kind of thing, but is there anything you come across that is useful, or I don't know?
Yeah, I don't know. It's an odd one. I mean, I suppose I spend a lot of my time teaching crime fiction and teaching novels. And yeah, so I suppose you're kind of in that headspace to some extent when you go to write the novels. But I like to try and keep those two things separate. I read an interview with Tim Winton, the great Australian novelist, a few years ago, and I remember him saying that he had two separate desks for different projects that he was working on. If one wasn't working, he would kind of swing round and sort of start on the other desk and see how he went. And I thought that's a great idea. So I actually do that. I physically got the desk where I do my academic stuff, and then I've got, the Clark Kent transformation as you turn to the other desk and try and write your fiction. So I think it's nice to try and keep that sense that you're moving into a different headspace and you're doing something different. But certainly having taught a course in crime fiction featuring Val McDermid and Ian Rankin and others over the past decade, that's been pretty useful. I think that's fed into the kind of techniques and your kind of approach to the material, I suppose.
For me, the only respect, there's two respects I think that journalism was useful to me as a writer of fiction. And the first one was to stop me being precious about writing. I don't have this, I must wait for the muse to strike, and I'll lie here on my chaise longue till it comes along. I mean, writing is my job, and so that's what I have to do. I have a deadline, I have to stick to it. I have to work to a schedule that will get me to the point where the book's ready. And that, I suppose, came from working as a journalist, because you can't not write the story because you're not feeling like it. The news doesn't wait on you to be in the right kind of mood. So I got over myself on the sort of writing being a precious thing very early on, because I understand that it doesn't matter what's going on in your life, if you can still knock out 1,000 words. They might not be very good 1,000 words, but you can go back and fix them and make them better and trim them and change them. But if you don't write anything, you've got nothing to work with. And the other thing that it gave me, which I hadn't really thought about till I started working on it, and really till I started writing fiction alongside writing journalism, was the database of characters. When you're a journalist, you have a front row seat in other people's lives. You walk into their lives, usually when something bad has happened, sometimes when something phenomenally good has happened, but you're there and you see them in extremis. And when people are in extremis, their characters are stripped bare and you see the real person underneath. And I had the great privilege of seeing all sorts of people in all sorts of conditions of life, everything from interviewing Prince Charles to dealing with homeless people. And that just gave me this huge data set of faces and places. You see people in their place of work, you see them in their place of leisure, you see them in your house. And that's sort of my great stockpile of character stuff. So when I'm thinking about, when I'm working on a book and I'm thinking, I need a character who can do this particular thing in this story to make the rest of it happen, kind of flick through the card index in the back of my head and think about the people that I've encountered over the years. And that's a really helpful thing.
So you have all of that on tap, but what other research have you had to do for, well, let's say still life and let's say 1979, because they're kind of both hanging out here?
Well, they're very different books, set in very different periods. With still life, most of the, I suppose if you'd call it research, was talking to artists and talking to people in that world about what they do, how it works, and also the usual thing of talking to some of my forensic science contacts. I always think that it's easier, I don't know if you feel the same about this, Liam, to research something if you find somebody that knows what they're talking about and sit them down with a beer or sit them down with a curry and start asking them questions about their job and their life and how the day goes. Because let's face it, most people, you come home after the day at work, if you're lucky to be able to go out to a day at work at the moment, you come home and if you're lucky, somebody in the house will say, "What was your day like?" And they don't really want you to answer. Nobody really cares what you've done while you've been out of the house. But to have somebody sitting across the table from you saying, no, really, tell me, what was your day like today? What did you do today? And so most people are incredibly delighted to talk about their lives, their job, the details of what they do. So that's a large part of the kind of research that went into still life, really. But for 1979, it was kind of different because although I remember quite a lot of 1979, there are bits of it that are frankly quite blurred. In the days of newspapers in Glasgow in 1970s, an awful lot of alcohol was consumed. So there were things that I remembered very clearly, but things also that I was kind of a bit, I wasn't quite sure about. I was a bit fuzzy around the edges with. And that's where I think newspapers are tremendously helpful when you're doing research into historical stuff in recent memory, because they sort of jog your memory, but they also tell you the kind of things that people were talking about and interested in. Because when you read sort of history of the 1970s or whatever, it will tell you about all sorts of things, about the politics, about the economics, about what was going on, about what was top of the charts. But it will not necessarily tell you what the story of the day was in the paper that people were talking about on the bus or talking about in the canteen. So it gives you access to those things, and it also lets you know what things like the price of a blouse in the House of Fraser sale, and what was on at the theatre, what was on at the cinema, what was on the telly, and all of those things. I think if you remember that yourself, sort of pile in and trigger other thoughts. And if you don't really remember it yourself, it gives you a sense of the time and the place. And when I was doing Place of Execution, for example, that was mostly set in 62 and 63, and I was like 7 years old. So my memory of what was in the bunty and what my favourite sweeties were wasn't terribly helpful.
Yeah.
But you went further back, didn't you, Liam?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think that's absolutely right. I mean, looking through newspapers in the Mitchell Library up there on the 5th floor, very often with the great Alan Parks sitting nearby, flicking through the Glasgow Herald for similar periods. But as you see, the great thing is the adverts. Job adverts. How much did you get if you were working as an accountant or a teacher or whatever in 1969 or 1975? What did a car cost? What did a house cost? So it's often not the sort of main news reports, but the kind of the things round about them that give you the real sense of the place. But it's also, as you say, Val, having a particular person. You can only get so much from books and newspapers. What you want is somebody that you can just pester, and email and phone them and have specific inquiries. So I've been very fortunate in that regard, in that my cousin, David McIlvanney, is a retired firearms instructor with Strathclyde Police. And so he's been really useful over the course of the books. And I also capitalised on the time difference, which is great from New Zealand, where before you go to your bed, I would say, write an email. How does this work, Davey? And then I would get up in the morning and he would have written sort of 3,000 words, complete with kind of hyperlinks and photos. I felt he should have got kind of co-credit for some of the books. But so having somebody that you can just go to in that respect is kind of invaluable.
And the funny thing is, when the end thing comes out at the other end, you know, my editor, Lucy Malagoni, is in her early mid-30s. So she wasn't even a twinkle in anyone's eyes in 1979 when this book's set. And my character is working as a journalist in Daily Record in Glasgow. And compared to most people, we were insanely well paid. And I'd been working at the Record for probably about 6 or 7 months when I bought my flat, because one, property was cheap, and two, I was really well paid. And this is something like this in the book, and she's like, "How is that even possible? You know, I live in London."
Yeah, a little bit different. I'm trying to think. There was a scene that there was something in Still Life that really struck me as hilarious. Karen Perry explaining all these things to Daisy, who is obviously just utterly oblivious, and thinking, yeah, we're kind of getting round to the point where I feel old, and you know, a thing popped up on my Facebook this morning. It's the anniversary of the day Thatcher died. And I remember sitting in the newsroom that day at the back of the room with the subs desk and looking over at the news desk and looking at them going, none of the news desk remembered her as the Prime Minister that day. And I looked over and went, that's really quite, because all the subs in our ancientness remember all these terrible things. And the news desk she was a former Prime Minister. That's all they'd ever known her as, which was terrifying.
Yeah, and the thing about Thatcher too is, of course, now we've got The Crown with Gillian Anderson playing the sort of sexy, vulnerable Thatcher. No. There's a whole generation of people out there who think that's what she was like.
No.
Don't start me. Just don't. You know that's a bad place to go.
Yeah, no, I wasn't very old, but I remember it quite vividly. And I've completely lost my train of thought there. Damn.
Right.
Sorry. You, with Karen Perry in Cold Cases, with the Quaker, you're writing about then and with Karen a bit of now. What is it about writing something historical that is attractive? And also, does it let you talk about contemporary issues in an easier or more interesting way than if you were just writing a contemporary novel?
I think in my own case, Louise, it's partly just being so far away and thinking, how long can you keep going on writing kind of topical political thrillers set in a place that you haven't really lived in for 10 years? So the attraction for me was actually that we're all in some sense equally distant from Glasgow in 1969. So, it gave you a sense that you could inhabit that world perhaps more convincingly than you could inhabit the sort of contemporary world. I think there's also, in the case of Glasgow, an attraction to going back to that kind of older city before everything was kind of tidied up and cleaned up. And when I was a student, we had the City of Culture in 1990 and all the sandblasting, and you had that sense of Glasgow kind of emerging out of its kind of darker past. And of course, for crime writers, we quite like to delve back into that kind of gritty, sort of darker past of the city. So I don't think it's any coincidence that we've had so many Scottish crime novels set in Glasgow, prior to the great transformation that overtook the city. Denise Mina's fabulous book, The Long Drop, Alan Parks's fantastic novels. So there's a kind of, in a way, I think it's the equivalent to, in Edinburgh, you've got that sense of the sort of touristy facade that, people like Ian Rankin are able to kind of pull back and expose the gritty underbelly. In Glasgow, I think that often tends to happen sort of through time, that we've got this kind of glitzy contemporary Glasgow, but crime writers like to kind of push back beyond that into the kind of grittier past.
Yeah, I think for me, I think part of it is that sense of it was a different world of policing then. It's much easier to write about the nature of crime solving when it wasn't all down to forensics, for example. And also, we're living in a time right now where, frankly, there are a lot of questions over the police force. Police force says, and their conduct, and particularly their conduct in relation to civil rights and the way that they police dissent. And in a way, you can look at that through the lens of history much more readily and be much more frank about it in lots of ways. And the reason I started writing this series now, it's something that's been kicking about in my head for a while, and I just hadn't quite got around to actually grappling with it. But for me, I can't write in the present day because, I mean, all my books have been set, broadly speaking, against the present. But I can't write against the present right now because there is no solid ground to stand on. Everything is shifting sands. So you either write a book that's kind of set before COVID and pretend COVID hasn't happened and Brexit hasn't happened and we're still in some perennial 2019, or you try to write about where we actually are in the sure and certain knowledge that by the time your book comes out, we'll be somewhere completely different. And right now you can have no idea where that somewhere completely different is. And I felt that I didn't feel confident writing about that, either of those things, because I'd already brought Karen Pirie right up to the edge of the lockdown. And so I didn't really feel I could go back from that. And I didn't want to write something that got things completely wrong about where we are and how people have reacted, how people have responded. And so it seemed to me that was the only option for me, was to go back to a time where I knew what happened, where I understood what was going on. And there are lots and lots of really interesting, I suppose, parallels or mirrors that you can use in this way. So, I mean, the plan is that I'm going to write 5 books set at 10-year intervals. So 79, 89, 99, 2009, 2019. So we kind of finish before all the cluster burach of Brexit and COVID. So for me, it is a chance to explore the past through the lens of the present, and also the present through the lens of the past. I mean, 79 is a fascinating year. You've got the winter of discontent. So you've got people striking for living wages. And then you've got the run up to the Scottish devolution referendum, and the way that was that thing where, Scotland voted yes for a parliament and Westminster said, no, you can't have it. So there were all sorts of unrest and oddness going on. And then, of course, we had Margaret Thatcher coming to power. Yeah. So it's really interesting. I mean, for me, interesting to write about that period. But to look at it from a distance as to what it was like living through it. I mean, I can remember, and sorry, if I'm going off a tangent here, shut me up. But I remember the general election of 1979. I was working in Glasgow, and I was sent to the count in the Kelvin Hall, which did all the seats in Strathclyde. And it was back in the days, obviously, before mobile phones or anything. And you weren't allowed to communicate when you were in the count. You weren't allowed to communicate with the outside world at all. You weren't allowed to make phone calls or take phone calls. So we were in the count in the Kelvin Hall, and it was basically for Strathclyde. It was a Labour landslide, and we were like practically dancing in the street. This is great. Fantastic. We've shown Thatcher the door, and then we got back to the office, and everybody was sitting there out looking suicidal. And we were like, "What is it? What is this?" Well, it's Thatcher. She's got in. And we're going like, "No." And it was that complete moment of thinking everything was going to be fine, and then arriving in the office in the middle of the night and realizing it was catastrophe. So, there's just so much stuff to go at.
Yeah, election nights are always really weird. I've worked several. We did UK ones, Scotland ones. We did a couple of US ones. We did the Brexit referendum. And you get to everybody's really excited until you get to the exit poll at like 10:05. And that sets the tone for the rest of the night. And you've got to get right through till 6 a.m. on whatever the exit poll says, because they are never that far out, which is incredibly depressing. And then you get 2014, where we got to 6 a.m. and went, okay, we've sent the papers. Oh, holy shit, Alex Salmond's just resigned. So that's never great. The Quaker is very much set and taking its inspiration is possibly not the right word, but around the time of the Bible John killings. Now, I wasn't in Glasgow at that time, but even I know that, and you still feel the ripples of that today. rereading it this week, I suddenly realized that you take that, the basic facts of that, but you bend it in so many ways, and it's just so much more, I shouldn't say so much more interesting than real life, but what made you choose that as a subject? I mean, it's kind of, isn't it something that you would want to, most people would shy away from in a way, because it's this, it's memorably an unsolved case. And memorably, everybody remembers the photo fit of the guy and they don't remember anything else. It must have been quite a difficult one to kind of grapple with.
I think, Louise, to some extent, the unsolved dimension was the attraction. As so often with crime fiction, you're kind of supplying what you don't get in real life. It wasn't solved in real life, but you can actually supply a solution in your fiction. But I also was very conscious, as you say, of not just following slavishly the facts of the cases as we know them, because I think that I actually started writing the book using the real names and using the facts as we know them, and I just felt about 20,000 words into it that the material was in charge of me, and it wasn't until I thought, I could just actually fictionalize this. Use the kind of basic lineaments or outline of the case, but actually, take it in different directions, that I thought I can actually be in charge of the material. But it's partly just the resonance of that case. I mean, as you say, I was born in 69, the year of the final Bible John murders, but it did cast a big shadow. It's a bit like, I think, the kind of Myra Hindley. You would open the paper and see Myra Hindley, every few months as a kid. The same in the West of Scotland, you'd open the Daily Record and there would be a feature on Bible John. There would be some reason to kind of trot that stuff back out. So it was just kind of always there. It kind of was always something that I knew I wanted to write about. And I think you sometimes get this idea as a writer that if it exists in real life already, there's not that much work to do to kind of fictionalize it. You've got the basis for your narrative. And of course, that's a complete misconception. You've got a lot of work to do to actually try and inhabit the material and turn it into a story of your own, as it were.
Yeah. And it's, sorry, I lost what I was just going to say there. Oh yeah, when I was growing up, I mean, we were on the other side of the country in Fife, but that Bible John was the bogeyman. It was, like if you're not in before it gets dark, Bible John will get you. It was that level of terror inflicted on small children. I mean, we didn't really know who Bible John was or what he'd done. We just knew that he was the bogeyman. And I imagine if you lived in Glasgow, it was, that to the power of N.
Yeah, when I was growing up, we got warned about, well, they didn't know who he was, but Robert Black, because I was of more or less of an age. And I remember we got talked to at primary school and not really understanding why, but being terrified by the end of this conversation about, and it basically would have been, just don't go anywhere with strange men. And of course, I lived on a farm and we had they weren't strange. They were reps and all of this kind of thing. And sometimes if they were coming through the village, when I got off the school bus, they would stop and give me a lift. And my friends would be just like wide-eyed at me getting into this car with a strange man, but they weren't strange men at all. Well, they were strange, but no.
But it's interesting though. I mean, you're saying there, Liam, about the way that you when you're writing the past and the present coalesce. I mean, you sometimes find yourself writing something that's completely fictitious, and then events overtake you, which is what's happened with my graphic novel Resistance, which was originally written as a radio drama, and that was about a pandemic. And I wrote that in 2017. The radio drama went out in 2017, and they wanted me to write a novel of it, and I didn't want to write it twice. So we sat down, and I found artist Catherine Briggs, and she's done a brilliant job of rendering this. And it was all set to roll out last May, and we were like, we can't do this because we're in the grip of something and we have no idea where it's going. But now we actually have a much stronger sense of how things are rolling out, and a bit more idea of where it is going and how people are living with this. I mean, I feel okay about it coming out there. But I mean, so many times, and this has happened to me and it's happened to other writers, you write something and before you know it, it happens. It's not just writing about the past that catches you. It's writing about things that haven't happened that then the present reflects what's in the books, and that's quite scary.
And McCarran has a lot of that. He has a very good habit of writing all these great spy novels that kind of seem to just then not entirely come true, obviously, but there's always a little something and you think, how the hell did he know that? It's kind of, I don't know, maybe there's something in the air that writers kind of breathe in that the rest of us don't.
There's something in the zeitgeist that just grabs you by the throat and pushes you down that road. And sometimes it's really spooky. I was writing one book, I remember, and I had it was Wire in the Blood. Teenage girls going missing, and everyone thinks they're runaways, and they're actually murder victims. And there was a young girl in Cheshire who'd disappeared, and the police were doing, oh, she's a traveller, she's a runaway, she's gone off with a bunch of other travellers. Nothing to see here. Look away now. And her body turned up a few weeks later in the river. And she had the same Christian name as the character that I was writing about at that particular point. And that was just really, oh my God. It was the same sort of setup. She's missing, she's a runaway. No, she's not actually.
Oh, that's very
it's weird.
creepy.
It's weirdly spooky when things like that happen, but they do happen quite often.
Yeah, I suppose life is kind of weirder than we give it credit for sometimes. If you wrote about it in a book, nobody would believe it, and yet it's true.
Well, I don't think anybody would believe much of the last year if you read about it in a book.
Oh, I know, and then you look at it, it's like Donald Trump. Who would believe that if you wrote it in a book? And we lived through it, but we lived through it. So, this is good. Thinking about characters, you've created Val, you've created several strikingly different characters. Tony and Carol, Kate Brannigan, Lindsay Gordon, Karen Perry. Liam, okay, I haven't read your previous novels, I'm sorry, but I love McCormack and the Quaker. Great characters. How do you, this is a bit of an awkward question in terms of how do you go about creating them? Do they come first? Does the story come first? How is that worked out? And I know once you've got a series, you're going to look at a story that comes to you and say this fits them and it doesn't. But how does the process begun for you?
I never know. When people ask these questions, I don't actually know what I do. Do you know that way you just think it's almost when you've written a novel, trying to sort of think back to your frame of mind when you started it or how you approached it. I find that quite difficult. I think possibly what I do is, is it David Mamet who said, character is action. You can have all your, you can prepare your dossier on a particular character and so on, but it's only when you actually put them into a situation where they've got a particular dilemma, let's say, and they jump one way rather than the other, that you kind of know who that character is. So I think it's a bit of a false dichotomy sometimes, does character or plot come first? You kind of find out who your characters are when you put them into a compelling plot and see how they react.
I think it's almost like a biofeedback system. Plot feeds character, feeds plot, feeds character. So every choice you make in terms of the character opens up possibilities in the storyline and closes down others. And then the thing you do with the storyline opens up possibilities for your character or closes down other things. When you are writing a series character, you're right, it is different because you start off with their limitations and their nexus of people around them, and that shapes the kind of story you can tell. But starting from scratch, I think I was really quite conscious starting off with Ali Burns that if I'm going to write about a character over a span of 41 years, there's got to be enough scope for her to develop and to continue to be interesting and to be shaped by the events that she's subjected to. So kind of in my mind, I wanted to allow her to be a bit protean, that she's capable of going in different directions, depending on where I send her, as it were. So she's I suppose we've established a kind of baseline in this book, and we kind of know the kind of young woman that she is and the kind of things that motivate her, that she's interested in, that drive her. And now for me, the thing is to to find the story that will take those motivations and that personality to the next stage, and then what will those events do to her, and where can she go with that? So it's at the moment, for me, it still feels like I'm on chapter 1 of this new character, and I don't know at this point where she's going to end up. But I do know that it's really got me fired up and really got me interested.
Oh, that's good. That's good. Who are some of your favorite characters in crime fiction? Any period now, 50 years ago, 100 years ago? Well,
I started off with Miss Marple, and I still think Miss Marple is a great detective character. I'm actually writing a Miss Marple story next year for a new collection of continuation Marple short stories, and I'm really excited about that because The Murder at the Vicarage was my gateway drug into crime fiction.
So that wasn't so long.
I think the short story is going to be called The Second Murder at the Vicarage. And so Marple was there right at the beginning, and I guess I love D. Ellen Pascoe.
Yeah.
I think Reg Hill over the years developed them into extraordinary characters, and I loved Laidlaw because those books were so different from anything else that I had read at the time. Sarah Paretsky's V.I. Warshawski was also, I think I was probably a little bit in love with Sarah Paretsky's V.I. Warshawski for quite a long time. And now I really like Ellie Griffiths characters. Nelson and Ruth, I think, are people that you pick up the new book and you want to know what's going to happen to them and how to relate to them. And of course, Mick Herron's bunch of characters in Slough House. I mean, what's not to love about them?
Yeah, that's probably one of the best ensembles around. I mean, it's so difficult to write a sort of ongoing team like that when you've got so many people that you want to do justice to.
How about you, Liam?
Yeah, I mean, I'm just reading the Mick Herron just now, but yeah, you're right. That ability to bring 5 or 6 people kind of onto the page and make them all vivid and make them live for you is quite extraordinary. I suppose I can't really see past the old Holmes Watson dynamic, and I've always just loved the fact that they don't hinge on car chases and dramatic action so much as the drama of perception, that Sherlock Holmes is able to look at someone and identify their occupation and marital status and all these other characteristics just from simply looking at them. I love that idea of that you could have a really dramatic revelation with kind of 2 guys sitting in armchairs, with a pot of marmalade between them.
Right, I'm going to look at this Q&A box because it's got a lot of stuff in it. Let's see. Sue Beckman says, Val, are you planning to bring Karen Pirie out of lockdown? I think the world wants to know.
Well, there will be more Karen Pirie. At some point during the process of writing these year novels, there will be more Karen Pirie. There's no doubt about that. And she is in the process of being transformed onto the small screen at the moment.
That must be quite exciting.
It is, yes. Yeah. It's an
even though it's not a new experience.
Well, it's new every time. It's always new because you're working with different people and in different settings and having different negotiations. So at the moment we've got Traces 2 being filmed practically as we speak, and then Karen Pirie will be off the stocks later this summer.
Sorry, I was. Thomas asks, any tips, since we were talking about fish suppers earlier, any tips for getting through a fish supper without encountering a rogue pinbone? I think buy it somewhere better would be my answer to that. Go for somewhere reputable. Oliver Godby, this is quite a nice one. The vast majority of crime writers I have enjoyed in the last decade are Scottish. Do you have any theories as to why Scottish people seem to make such excellent crime writers? Don't know. Is it something in the water? Is there a handshake?
Well, Liam, you're the professor of Scottish studies.
Yeah, come on.
Yeah, well, it's partly just the very, very long tradition of kind of dark, crime-focused writing in Scotland. I mean, I teach my course on Scottish crime fiction, but in the first class, we look at the ballads, look at some of the old border ballads, which are often organised along the lines of murder mysteries, and often deal with violent crime in a brilliantly kind of cinematic fashion that you think kind of points forward in interesting ways to later work. But even if you go back to the great traditions of the Scottish Gothic and people like James Hogg and his private memoirs and confessions, even Walter Scott, I always think Walter Scott's The Two Drovers is in some sense the first Scottish crime story. So that I think when you've got that wealth of literary tradition to draw on, it's something that sustains contemporary writers. And if you look at someone like Ian Rankin, of course, his first Rebus book is a kind of retelling of the Jekyll and Hyde story. So you see, I think, contemporary crime writers quite deliberately drawing on that long tradition. So that would be one reason.
Yeah, I think that tradition of sort of the darkness in Scottish writing and the Scottish society is one element that we are interested in the sort of psychological mainsprings of these things. And there's also what Hugh McDermid called the Caledonian Anti-System. So you've got the yoking together of two opposing forces. So you've got on one side the dark Presbyterianism, and on the other side you've got the sort of Gaelic culture of music and dance and singing, and so these things kind of pull against each other. But I think what kicked the sort of wave of Scottish crime writing into action really in the 70s with Laidlaw, and then beyond that, was for the first time in a long time, Scotland was asking itself questions about who we are in the world. What does it mean to be Scottish? What kind of Scotland do we want to be living in? Do we want our own parliament? Are we different? And that coincided with the point at which crime fiction generally in the UK had become, it escaped from Scotland Yard and St Mary Mead and had become much more a novel of contemporary life, shining a light on how we live now. So you had writers like John Harvey writing about Nottingham, Reg Hill writing about mid-Yorkshire, Ruth Rendell writing about not about the kind of grand society of London, whatever. And those traditions came together at the right time when we wanted to ask those questions of ourselves, and the form of crime writing had become something that permitted of that kind of writing. So it was one of those, sort of perfect moments, a perfect storm, and that all married in with the general darkness of the Scottish imagination to provide a perfect confluence.
And I think that point that you mentioned, Val, about the sort of Calvinist dimension is relevant too, that you've got a society where people are accustomed to, I suppose, take evil seriously as a phenomenon, but also they're accustomed to looking behind the facade of respectability to see the kind of true sinful nature of humanity. So that's always going to be fertile ground for crime writers.
And it stays dark longer in the winter.
You've got to find something to do in the house, right? I feel like I want to come to New Zealand and study Liam's course. It sounds fascinating. Right, here's
They've got a very good visiting professor.
So I hear. Okay, whose writing of crime fiction for books or TV or film do you admire these days? And I guess previously. I don't know, I don't watch TV, so I'm utterly lost.
Well, I mean, the obvious first name on the list would be Jed Mercurio, who's got a tremendous track record. But I have to say, when we were working with Amelia Bullmore on the 2 series of Traces, Amelia sort of cut her teeth she did a radio series called Craven that had Maxine Peake in it. Some people might remember on Radio 4, ran several series of that. And then she started writing for Scott and Bailey when she was still acting in Scott and Bailey. And working with her on Traces has been absolute eye-opening stuff. She's just such a hard worker, so dedicated, such an eye for detail, and she writes great scripts. And so I would say she's definitely somebody to be keeping a serious eye on for the future.
Liam, any favourites for you?
No, like you, I kind of try to. I think, yeah, I should really sit down and binge watch some crime drama, but I'm too busy reading books, so I don't really watch a lot of crime drama.
Okay. Colin Ward says he's thoroughly enjoying catching up on Val's books. Really love the audiobooks. Do you think it's important to have a Scottish narrator for your Scottish fiction?
Yeah, I think it matters because so much of the, if you like, the accent of a book, the setting of a book is in the nature, the rhythms of the prose, if you like. It's not just the dialogue, it's the rhythms of the prose. So, for example, when I was writing the Lindsay Gordon books, I very much had a Scottish rhythm of prose in my head. So if I ever read from the Lindsay Gordon books, then I will read them in those rhythms. I'll read it in a Scottish accent. Kate Brannigan, totally Manc. I hear those books in my head are all the rhythms, the speech rhythms of Manchester. And when I'm reading, when I was reading Brannigan, in the days when I would read Brannigan to book events and things, I would always try and read it in a sort of northern accent, you know, because that way that was what it was written in. It was written in those rhythms, and it sounded best when it was in those rhythms. Yeah, I think for audiobooks, it really helps if you've got a writer who is conscious of writing in that way. Then it helps to have the right sort of accent.
Yeah, it's crucial. I mean, I was very lucky to have Angus King narrating the Quaker, who then went on to narrate Shuggie Bain and various much more eminent books. But he was fantastic because he had that versatility that I think he's from Perthshire. So I had, my central character as a Highlander, and then the Glasgow context. Having an accent that was kind of pitched somewhere in between actually worked brilliantly.
Yeah, I've sent some talking books back because the narrator just had the wrong voice in my head completely. I tell you something that I've got, obviously, because my books are translated to so many languages, I have other language audiobooks. And I can remember a time after, it's a long time ago now, when I had my knee operations, I had trouble sleeping at night. And I used to put the German audiobooks on the CD player at bedtime. And there was, because the person who read them had such a great voice, just a really rich, lovely, beautiful voice. And of course, I wasn't being distracted by the meaning. So I'd just lie there with this wonderful voice, lulling me to sleep in German.
Okay. I've got nothing there. I really don't. Which is quite handy because we're just about out of time. So I'm going to very quickly say that Val's book, The Distant Echo, is one of the April picks for the Bloody Scotland Book Club. So if you hover on over to Facebook and search for Bloody Scotland Book Club, you can join in the chat. There is a live event on the 28th of April in which several people, including me, but don't let that put you off, will be talking about that and the other two books that we've got lined up. Don't forget to use your Waterstones link to go and buy books, buy everything, because they're all brilliant. And thank you to Luca and Steve for organising all of this. And thank you to Liam and to Val for submitting to questioning from me. Yeah, and I think that's pretty much us. So I'm gonna
Thanks very much.
Thank you.